Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Curt Witynski, and this is one of a series of interviews I've been conducting on behalf of the More Housing Wisconsin project, which is co sponsored by the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and the Wisconsin Builders Association. The focus of this series of interviews has been housing, and more particularly, what can local governments do to generate more housing for their communities? What strategies can they employ? What policy changes can they make? We will be talking with, and we've been talking with, both public sector and private sector experts on housing policy, and also academic researchers whose focus is on housing policy. Which brings us to today's guest, who I'm really pleased to be able to spend some time with. Curt Paulsen is a professor of urban planning at the University of Wisconsin, where he focuses research and his career is focused on housing, and particularly affordable housing policy and finance, as well as other aspects of housing policy. Curt, thank you for joining me, and I really appreciate you taking some time out to spend with me.
Thanks, Curt. It's good to have the
Yeah.
two Curts together.
That's right. That's right. And we've been together in the past and in other parts of our lives, and so we're familiar with one another, and that's great. So why don't we just what I thought we'd do is talk about kind of this broad concept of, well, there is a housing shortage both in the United States and in Wisconsin, as you're well aware and your research has shown, and there's a housing affordability crisis, and there's lots of macroeconomic reasons for this that people are familiar with. We had the Great Recession caused this great drop in housing construction, and we haven't really climbed back out of that. We had the COVID, which caused construction costs to skyrocket, and um, what the other impacts on the
High
cost.
interest rates.
Yes, higher interest rates. Thank you. Yes, and most recently, I've been reading articles about people like myself and you. I imagine we live in our home. We have a low interest rate, and we're not really interested in jumping into the market right now because of that high interest rate. So we have existing homes that aren't entering the market as part of the whole effect. So, given all that, what role, if any, can local governments play in trying to resolve or help remedy this housing shortage? You think there's a role for local governments?
Yeah, so there's obviously a role for local governments, and there's not a whole lot you can do on interest rates,
Right.
and there's not a whole lot you can do on construction costs, but you can control what's in your purview, and it shouldn't be an excuse to just not do anything, right? So again, if we think about the cost to produce a home as land, lumber, labor, and lending, right? You can, at the margin, you can reduce construction costs by allowing smaller homes on smaller lots, expediting the development approval process, anything to kind of speed the process along, allow people to build a more flexible product. On the lending side, a lot of municipalities have been looking at the financing, providing financing or gap financing or kind of credit enhancements. Certainly at the state level, the $500 million that the legislature put forth to really help deal with construction costs. Sometimes the infrastructure costs means that the upfront lower cost loan to build the water, sewer, roads really helps you to get a product, housing delivery to the market. So the other thing that local governments can do is just audit your zoning, audit your processes, and ask, we may never get a $200,000 new home constructed just because of costs. But what can we do to reduce our costs, to reduce our delays, to reduce the zoning barriers? So it's kind of flipping the script. It's starting with maybe meet with developers and say, what would it take for you to deliver a home that would be affordable for a teacher or a nurse or a police officer? And what do we have to do as a city to help you get there? Flexible lot sizes, reduced parking requirements, narrower roads. So it really is looking at controlling what's in your purview.
Right. And local governments, and there are some local governments in Wisconsin who have taken that to heart and said, okay, what zoning changes can we do? What can we implement to make it easier for density to occur and more housing to be built in our community? And I'm sure you've observed this, and as a resident of Dane County, So City of Madison is one who's been proactive about changing their zoning, and they've taken this very intentional effort by their planning department and their policymakers to make the type of changes you're talking about for local governments to make it easier to densify housing and maybe create more multifamily housing within the community. Are you surprised by some of the reactions? I frankly was, and by some of the reactions from the neighborhood association and individual, homeowners who are already kind of in place, and very strongly and stridently pushing back against the city and policymakers and planning department in suggesting some of these changes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it's no surprise. The research has been identifying this for years, right? That for most people who own their home, that's the single largest value asset that they own. And as we say, you can insure it against fire and flood, but not against uh, your perceived decline in the value of your home because new housing is built in your neighborhood. So it's no surprise that whether it's in Dane County or Waukesha County, right? It's not a political ideology thing. It's largely this perception that the value of my home will be negatively impacted by either new housing or a greater affordability around me. And so, we can talk till we're blue in the face and cite all the research we want. But of course, people react emotionally. And that's what you see now. They just have many more outlets on Nextdoor or Twitter or Reddit, depending on
right.
what age you're in, to just object to it. So, part of it is the public planning of explaining the need, communicating, showing pictures, helping walk people through. But I think part of it is also, you know, helping our elected officials, our plan commissioners to hear the other voices, to kind of counter mobilize, whether it's the business community or the school district or people who are social service providers, to just help explain why the shortage of housing means that kids are moving around a lot, therefore they can't learn in school, to help explain why we can't get workers for the jobs we have in the community because we can't find housing. And so it really is that kind of, it when there's a new housing proposed, right? Housing dies the death of 1,000 cuts because it's this particular project on this particular parcel. And the
Yes.
10 people next door show up and write letters and get angry and say, no, no, no. But the people who are supporting that housing, it's really diffuse, right? So you need to counter mobilize. Of course, you need to educate, explain the need, but you're never really going to convince people that they need housing right next to them,
Yeah.
right? So we always say we need to build more housing, but the people who already have housing don't exactly want more housing to be built. So, I can give examples where we've been successful in getting people to get housing approved. The other thing I noticed, particularly in the Madison debate, is interesting. People aren't against housing, they're against development and developers.
Uh
And of
huh.
course, that's a bit of a misnomer because how do you get housing other than developers building housing?
Right.
So part of it is reframing, right? Talk about the workforce needs, talk about housing. Sometimes I like to ask people, well, did you build your own home? Well, of course you didn't. A developer built that, right? So,
Yes. Yeah.
but we're very much aware of the fact that, people don't like developers and development because it produces traffic, more kids in the schools, perceived parking challenges. But of course, you just multiply that and let the neighbors have a veto, then you just don't get the housing you need. And all of a sudden you look around and housing's really expensive and homelessness is on the rise. At least in Dane County, people drive an hour for a $17 an hour job, right? They live way out in Baraboo or Beaver
Right.
Dam or Janesville. I was just in Kenosha last week and they have people commuting 40, 50 miles for the manufacturing jobs that they have. Eau Claire
Right.
to La Crosse, they're having the same conversation.
Exactly. And I can't tell you how many times, and it's not only in Madison, but it's, this comes up across the nation even. People will say, uh, in the abstract, I'm a for more housing. I understand we need more housing, we need more affordable housing. But then what happens, like you said, right next to them, then it becomes, more emotional reaction and it's more difficult for someone to say, oh yeah, I'll welcome that, new 4-story, apartment building right next to my house.
And the truth is, though, if you interview people a couple years later, it's never as bad as they thought it was.
I agree.
And the people become embedded in the community, in the neighborhood. Their kids go to the same school as yours, and it's never as bad as people say.
Yeah. Yep.
But it's the biggest hurdle, right?
It is. That is the
Because
biggest
it's
hurdle, and we've got to come up with some strategies. And you mentioned some good educational things, and I think empathy too by the city staff, just to express it and understand that this is the way people are going to react initially. Um, one thing you mentioned in your discussion about some things that local governments can do with regard to like housing and land use changes to maybe welcome smaller lot sizes and smaller homes. I came across a statistic, you've probably seen this before too, that I think in the 1970s, maybe 45% of housing, single family homes were, 1,500 square feet or less.
yep.
Today, so something like 7%. How do we get, what would it take to get back to maybe some of those more starter homes, or am I just
Yeah.
not foolish
Right.
and naive to think that'll ever happen again?
Yeah. So I think we have to get back there, right? Because that entry level rung on the ladder is gone, that small, and that's the house I grew up in Wausau. It was a 1944 FHA, 6,000 square foot lot. And it was totally fine. It was a middle class neighborhood, teachers, doctors, lawyers, all living in the same neighborhood. So I guess I would say to most elected officials who are older, can you build the house you grew up in your city today? Right. So you kind of appeal to the heartstrings and say that the type of housing we used to build all over Green Bay, Janesville, everywhere, it's the kind of smaller house on a smaller lot. And then if you can show some numbers to say, how much would this cost? And what's the starting salary of a teacher in your school district? Right? Because everyone knows that we need teachers, we need police officers in our community. So it asks the question, can the people who serve your community, can they afford to live there? And it is looking at lot sizes. So you see that a lot of communities are looking at what can we do to get that kind of 5 or 6,000 square foot lot to allow that kind of narrower home, maybe with an alley loaded product. We can show them tons of good designs all around the state that show that this is an attractive kind of stable community. It's not what they perceive of as density.
Hmm.
So a lot of that is showing the pictures, showing the high quality homes that you can build. There's a lot of cases here in Dane County where communities have actively worked with a developer for narrower houses, townhomes, lots. And so we can show pictures and show, yeah, this is high quality housing.
Right.
But you're
Yep.
absolutely right. If we don't have that entry level product, then we'll continue to see that, Gen Z, millennials, they're not going to be able to buy the same home that our parents bought when they were starting out.
Exactly. My sons are now 29 and 26. They can't conceive of that option. It'll probably happen someday, but not later rather than earlier.
Yeah.
Hey, so
A lot
final.
of
Oh,
us
go
who
ahead.
are
Go ahead.
stably housed, right? We don't
Yes,
think there's a housing crisis because our house has gone up, we refinanced, but yeah, the next generation can't afford to buy a home.
no. Final question, Kurt. I really appreciate this. If you could just give one, simple or recommend one step that a local government could take to maybe allow for more creation of more housing, different options of housing in their community, what would that be?
So I know there's a lot of resources out there. So I would say the one thing you can do is it takes political leadership, business community leadership to say, what do we have to do to flip the script? We start with yes and then work backwards. Most communities start with no, right? Oh,
Hmm.
you're going to have to convince us. You're going to have to show that you have water, sewer. You're going to have to go through all these design. You kind of have to convince us that we should allow you to build housing in our community. Instead, flip the script. Start with yes. Get ready for housing. Say yes to housing, and then work back from there. What does it take in terms of zoning, finance, community conversation? Um, so there's a lot of great resources,
Yeah.
including More Housing Wisconsin and the CNU guide that the league put together. A lot of resources. You can look at the City of Middleton zoning ordinance. We just,
Yeah.
created a great zoning ordinance, cut and paste that. But it
Great.
really is that flipping that switch to starting with yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kurt. Really appreciate this quick interview and lots of good information there. And uh, maybe we'll circle back and have another conversation in 12 months. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thanks.